I welcome you all to this second session of our discussion of literary criticism. If you remember, we are in fact, trying to have an overview of the different critics that were prominent in different ages. We started with, and let me, for the benefit of all of us, you as well as me, in order to help ourselves get onto the track again this morning, let us recapitulate things briefly. We have seen, I'll take only 2 or 3 minutes to revise the whole thing that we discussed in our last lecture, so that you know what is it that we are talking about. We are talking about literary criticism, which in the second half of the 19th century began to be called literary theory. The word literary theory wasn't in vogue, wasn't in fashion in earliest of times. In fact, great minds, great scholars like Plato and Aristotle, they started telling us what literature is. And this reminds me of the fact that literary criticism, in the ultimate analysis, remains, this is my belief, my conviction. Somebody else has every right to dispute this opinion or this view, but I am of the opinion that literary criticism in the ultimate analysis remains subjective. And hopefully you all know the meaning of subjective. Subjective means laying emphasis on the self. It's me, myself, having a certain opinion about literature. But it depends who this me is. Who is this person whose opinion we are studying? If the person happens to be of Plato's scholarly status or caliber, what he believes to be true or thinks is true, we have got to give weight to what he says. If a person of Aristotle's caliber, person who in his own day was believed to have all knowledge that was available to humankind, if he believed in certain things, we have got to say that his opinion carries weight. It's in fact opinions of different people about the nature of literature. The opinions of different people about the nature of literature. But if it happens to be an informed opinion, the opinion of a celebrated academic, a great scholar, a great mind, then that opinion, begins to matter. So what Plato said about different things, people take him seriously. What Aristotle said about different things, people take him seriously. And what are those different things? Literary creations. And mind you, in those days, in the pre-Christ era, that is in the pagan Greek era, when most of these scholars, they did not believe in any of the divine religions. They were all pagans, but they did have their belief in deities that they believed to be their deities, like different gods and goddesses. But their opinions about literary creations, this is what we are talking about. What Aristotle said. Aristotle, I told you the other day, talked about tragedy. And why is it that today again I have started talking about Aristotle and Plato? Because in later lectures, when we start talking about structuralism and almost the latest bandwagon that people are trying to jump onto, यानी वो जो भेड़ चाल है ना, जिसके ऊपर सारे लोग सवार होने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं उस गाड़ी पे, वो तनकीद के शोबे के अंदर स्ट्रक्चरलिज्म है. Structuralism. But later on, because man's thinking, is always undergoing an evolution. लोगों की सोचों में इर्तिका आ रहा है और structuralism के साथ बात खत्म नहीं हो जाती. When more people, begin to think about what structuralists were telling us, they came out with new ideas called post-structuralist ideas or the theory of deconstruction. So my point is that most of these critics who followed Aristotle, they seem to have benefited a great deal from Aristotle's ideas. They seem to have benefited a great deal from Aristotle's ideas. That's why it's important to know a bit about different critics in different ages. But I started with my contention that all criticism in the ultimate analysis tends to be subjective. If I say something about a movie, if I say something about a novel, if I say something about a play, it's my opinion about that play. But because I, being a student of literature, if I have read a number of novels, a number of plays, and I feel like saying that which ones, in my opinion, happen to be more successful than some others, I also begin to analyze that if some of the opinions, some of the plays, some of the novels were considered, more successful, what made them more successful? And whatever somebody says in this regard becomes his literary opinion or literary theory. Do you get my point? It is simply, somebody trying to make an opinion about a literary work. It isn't something difficult. It's very interesting. And we have seen that in the earliest times, people attached a lot of importance to what the Greeks had to say because they believed they knew everything. Greeks, they thought that they knew everything because in those days, they were great scholars. Great scholars. They were called philosophers. And I usually tell my students that philosophy, and in spite of the fact that philosophy nowadays it is being studied as a subject. It's just one subject. And unfortunately, it isn't taught and learned in most of our, not all, in most of our schools and colleges. But in olden times, all knowledge, the whole bulk of knowledge was deemed philosophy. And Plato and Aristotle, they were all, Socrates, Archimedes, Euripides, Sophocles, Thespis, they were all called philosophers, great Greek philosophers. So what they said mattered. My point is that literary criticism, in fact, happens to be nothing but the opinion of an informed academic about a literary work. एक पढ़ा लिखा, बहुत पढ़ा लिखा बंदा किसी अदबी तख्लीक के मुतल्लिक, किसी अदब पारे के मुतल्लिक क्या राय रखता है, वो ये उसकी क्रिटिसिज्म बन जाती है. और चूंकि वो बंदा बहुत ज़्यादा पढ़ा लिखा है, उसने उस सब्जेक्ट की नेचर को बहुत ज़्यादा मुतालिया किया है, तो हम उसकी राय को वक़्त देने लगते हैं, दुनिया उसकी बात को सुनने लगती है. दिस इज़ व्हाट लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म इज़. बट there is something that I call empirical evidence. There are, that some of the movies, they seem to become hit, some others do not. Some of the novels, they are very readily accepted and sold. They, as they say in that hackneyed idiom, they sell like hotcakes because they become very popular with the people. If they become popular, then you begin to focus your attention on the contents of that work and the methodology of that work. How is it that movie or that particular novel became very popular? Or let me give you one example. You all know that we are all familiar with the movie Titanic. When it first came into light, let us say, when it was there, in the beginning, it became an instant hit. It became an instant hit. Everybody liked it. In literary discussions, we talk about one thing, and that one thing is litmus test of good literature. And what is that one thing? That one thing is that a literary piece its appeal should go beyond the confines of time and place, the limits of time and place. You all know that Shakespeare was writing his plays in the 16th century, around the end of the 16th century and beginning of a first decade almost of the 17th century. Means 400 years ago. He wrote his plays about 400 years ago. Quite removed from us, time-wise. But we read his plays and enjoy his plays even today. And where is it that he happened to be? Where is it that he dwelt? In England. He lived in England. उर्दू में हम उसे पंजाबी उर्दू में कहते हैं सात समंदर पार, काला पानी, इतनी दूर थे वो हमसे. And even then, you notice that most of the people in the world, they read Shakespeare's plays and enjoy them. So naturally, it begins to strike you that you feel impelled, you feel induced, you feel persuaded to try and find out what is so particular about Shakespeare's work that even after a lapse of 400 years, people still read Shakespeare, even being quite away from where it was originally written and played, people still read his play or plays. The test is that a good literary piece, its appeal goes beyond the confines of time and space. Now, if its appeal goes beyond the confines of time and space, you should ponder over the fact that what is it, in this literary work? What is it that is there in this movie Titanic that seems to appeal to so many people? An instant appeal. Youngsters, even in countries like China and Russia, you find them, all carrying holders or file covers with the images of the protagonist, the hero and the heroine in that movie. It means that in spite of the fact that the movie was in English and those people who seemed to like it very much, Chinese and Russians, what is there? So you begin to ponder. And when you come out with an opinion, it becomes a literary creation. It becomes a piece of criticism. And when I thought about that movie, what is it that it became an instant hit? What is it that made it an instant hit? And I concluded because the movie maker, very sanely, very cleverly, very intelligently, he talks about one thing which is common to all human beings, and that one thing is love. I keep telling you that if we take love out of our lives, if we subtract love out of our lives, if we say no to love, the love that you have for your parents and your brothers and sisters, for your country, for your religion, supposing for a while you take it out of your being, out of your person, out of your hasti, what will you be like? You will be like a deflated balloon. गुब्बारा होगा जिसमें से हवा निकल गई है. It is love, that keeps us attached to this world. So it is natural. And that is why, Aristotle said that the instinct to imitate is natural with human beings. I keep telling my students, and probably it is mentioned by Aristotle too, that a young child, very small child, he begins to copy his grandfather, that his grandfather walks like this. Small girls might, feel like copying their grandmothers, that the grandmother, if they are lucky enough to have that older grandmother or grandfather, they begin to copy them. It is there, we have by nature, programmed to say something about things in our environments. And then this is what criticism is. Trying to say something about things in the world. And because we happen to be in the realm of literary criticism, trying to say something about literary works. In the beginning, it was called criticism. Later on, in the 19th century, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, literary criticism, opinions of the people about different literary works, it proliferated, it multiplied. Many people, because as time passes, and by the way, let me say one thing in between this discussion. There is another word that is simply theory. आजकल एक लफ्ज़ ये भी फैशन में है, सिर्फ theory. बेटे हम बातें कर रहे हैं. We are talking about literary criticism. We are talking about literary theory. But there is one word, please be mindful of the word, that I am not talking about literary theory. I am not talking about literary criticism. I am talking about the word theory. Simply theory. Now, you might say, well, what is theory? Theory means knowledge. There is such a lot of, I happen to be of the opinion that two things, that the people of the modern era are faced with. Two things. Two problems that we are faced with. Two things that are making our lives with the passage of every day, somewhat difficult. And those two things are fast or rapidly increasing population, shrinking our resources on the globe, fast increasing population. And then the other thing, more important for you as young students, is the information explosion. So on the one hand, you have population explosion. On the other hand, you have the information explosion. So many things are there in the realm of IT. Nowadays, we are talking a great deal about artificial intelligence. We are talking about a great deal about nanotechnology. We are talking a great deal about biotechnology and a host of these things, A lot many researches are going on in different fields of knowledge. And all these things are adding to your knowledge. And all this, a writer too, because as I pointed out to you the other day, he doesn't happen to be in a vacuum or in the ether. He doesn't exist in the ether. He is being bombarded with all this knowledge. And inevitably, he has got to make use of this knowledge in his writings. All this knowledge is called theory. It is simply theory. Theory means a lot of research that has been carried out, a lot of information that is available in different branches of learning. In scientific branches, technological branches, means physics, chemistry, biotechnology, or even medical subjects like neurology, brushing shoulders, with linguistics, and linguistics brushing shoulders with neurology. So this is what is going on. Means different people, they are being bombarded with writers and they try to benefit from them. Now, your problem as readers is that if you do not happen to know a little about those different disciplines, it becomes difficult for you to follow things. But this is what necessitates being avid readers. You've got to do a lot of reading to keep yourselves abreast of what is going on in this age. Anyway, you notice that there has been a remarkable evolution in critical thinking. There has been a remarkable evolution in critical thinking. After the Greeks, you do not have many remarkable critics in the Christian era. There is only one name, and I told you that name. That was Longinus on the Sublime in the Christian era. And later on, when it comes to medieval or medieval, both the pronunciations are correct. Later on in the medieval era, you have Dante. Most of the British pronounce it as Dante. Many prefer to call it as Dante or Dante. Okay, whatever the pronunciation. Dante, he is the first one, who begins to take the language of literature seriously in his book, De Vulgari Eloquentia. And the book was written at the very start of the 14th century, 1303 and 1305, around 1303, 1305. Dante wrote this critical work. And then we have already seen that in Renaissance, there isn't much, but there are two remarkable works. Putnam, there's one name, Putnam. It is pronounced strangely, but it is Putnam, Puttenham, as if it were Puttenham. But they don't pronounce it as Puttenham. They pronounce it as Putnam. He, in the 16th century, he wrote a book, and the name of that book is The Art of English Poesy. This book came out in 1589. But more significant in this era is Sidney's book, Apologies for Poetry. Sidney's Apology for Poetry or Defense of Poetry. Because that is where he seems to, for the first time, have sown the seeds of analytical reasoning. He begins to talk about the nature of poetry, the nature of poetic processes, faculties, the poetic faculty that the poet draws on or makes use of, and the language that in his day seemed to be popular with writers of poetry. This is what was going on in Renaissance, because these two works particularly Sidney's, Apology for Poetry, extremely remarkable. This is in the 17th century, we have already seen. They again tend to refer to the classical, writers. They rely heavily on classical writers and rules. And we come across a host of important nouns or names, and they are Ben Jonson's Timber or Discoveries, 1640. Then Corneille's Discourse in 1660. Then Boileau's Prefaces and Boileau's La Art Critique. Boileau's La Art Critique. I'm now talking about the 17th century. Now, then Dryden, the most prominent critic of, the one that you should try to read and acquaint yourselves with as students of literature, is Dryden. In the 17th century, you have Dryden, and in addition to his prefaces and dedications and prologues, he also wrote his essay on poetry or essays on poetry. And Dryden is the first, critic that strikes us as being extremely judicious and discriminating. Extremely judicious and discriminating. Open-minded at the same time. So his essays, we can say that they are the ones that show the way to proper function of criticism. Dryden's essays showed the way to the proper function of criticism. Then we have been talking about the 18th century. We have seen that Pope in the 18th century, in his essay on criticism, once again, in addition to attaching a lot of importance to nature, being natural, he also attaches a lot of importance to rules. But interestingly, round the end of the 18th century, there is one name, and that name is the name of an Italian critic and philosopher, G.B. Vico, V-I-C-O, G.B. Vico. He is the one, who, in my opinion, you have every right to dispute my opinion. He is the one person, who for the first time began to lay emphasis on historicism. Historicism means that literary creations have got to be looked at, evaluated, judged in their historical context. And Dr. Johnson, in his writings, critical writings, tends to be of the same point of view. In other words, he is emphasizing the importance of context. But that context is historical context. Normally, when we talk about context, we talk about social and economic context. And good histories like the one penned down by Compton and Rickett, they give you, when they start talking about different periods, लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री के डिफरेंट जो दौर हैं, तो हर दौर के अंदर वो बताते हैं कि यहाँ मईशत के सिमत में चल रही थी, माशरत के सिमत में चल रही थी, उस मुल्क की सियासत के सिमत में चल रही थी. क्योंकि जैसे मैं कहता रहता हूँ कि every writer, he being a human being, he has got to live in a certain social milieu. So he is bound to be affected by the social milieu. But you notice that this approach seems to have stirred a lot of thinking. 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, in fact, late 18th century, people began to react to emphasis on rules laid by the classical or neoclassical writers. Neoclassical writers, they laid a lot of emphasis on rules. But Vico, as I was talking, the person I was talking about a moment ago, he said that there are no absolute rules that a literary piece can be judged by. There are no absolute rules that a literary piece can be judged by. So there was a lot of thinking about the nature of literature, the nature of poetic process, that is whatever happens to be or going on, whatever happens to be going on in the mind of the poet or the writer, these things, they attracted a lot of attention. In addition to what exactly should be the poetry, language of poetry like. Language kaisi honi chahiye? And then you have big names like that of Wordsworth, you have big names like Shelley's, you have big names like Matthew Arnold's, yes. All these people, you know, Wordsworth laying a lot of emphasis on language. Language means, I told you the other day that he tends to emphasize the fact that the language of poetry has got to be the language of the rustics. And Coleridge disagreeing with him that and maintaining that because poetry is an art and it has got to be somewhat sublime, it has got to be somewhat elevated, it should be in good language, aesthetically good. It should be good language. It should be appealing to. And this is something that I personally agree to, because there are in our own poetry, leaving aside, you know, English poetry, in our own poetry, when it comes to Urdu poets, I usually say that I like Urdu poets like Faiz Ahmad Faiz a great deal. Now, why is it? I don't claim to be able to understand, you know, Faiz's philosophy, all of it, but I enjoy reading his language. Atlaso ka ख्वाब, लफ्ज़ इतने मुलायम और गुदाज हैं कि आप उनको भी इंजॉय करते हो. तो मैं कहना ये चाह रहा हूँ कि even the language of poetry matters a great deal, in addition to his emphasis or the emphasis of the poets on the content. Content के अलावा language भी matter करती है, because both these things contribute to making a literary work appealing and beautiful. And then the second half of the 19th century, that was the half when critical theories proliferated a great deal. And this is what I was talking about a short while ago, that the second half is very important, because this is where we encounter, you know, structuralism in its very initial stages, though it got into vogue around the 1930s and 50s. But the second half of the 19th century, very important, because that is where you have theories like art for the sake of art. And I am of the opinion that art for the sake of art, in fact, you know, happens to be very close to the contention of the new critics. The new critics who tended to attach importance to the text. They tended to attach importance to the text. Now, let us wind up this discussion by maintaining that the second half of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, it's very rich in respect of production of critical theories. A lot many theories like colonialism, that is one thing that we have got to look at in later lectures. Feminism, that's another thing we have got to look at in later lectures. Structuralism, another thing we've got to look at in later lectures. And deconstruction or post-structuralism in later years, you know, these are the things that we have got to look at. So when we meet again, be prepared, if possible, do go through some of your matter on structuralism, what structuralism is. When we meet again, maybe next week, we'll talk about the different theories, taking up each theories one by one and discussing them in detail. We have up till now only been able to see that there has been a sort of evolutionary progress in critical thinking. Critical views today do not happen to be the same as they were in olden times. But in order to be able to understand something new, you have got to be very well aware of what preceded a certain thing. Even Newton, when he was appreciated a great deal for his findings, he said that whatever I have been able to do, I have been able to do or achieve by standing on the shoulders of my past masters, shoulders of the past scientists. And this incidentally also was the the contention of Dr. Abdus Salam, who gave us his theory on electromagnetic forces. So every new, a prominent scientist has got to benefit from the researches of the past masters. Every new theory has got to benefit from the preceding theories. And ultimately, as teachers of English language and literature, you make your own opinion. You make your own opinion, but in order to be able to make your own opinion, you should be very well aware of the opinions of the other people. This is what in linguistic context we call eclectic approach. Eclectic, E-C-C. Eclectic approach. Eclectic means knowing all the theories and then beginning to practice and believe in one. So this is where I'm going to end today's talk. When we meet again, we'll talk about structuralism. Thank you very much.